What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily. So Motorola has three really good G series phones this year. The Moto G Play, their most affordable option, which decisively ditched its worst phone of the year distinction from last year. It's actually a solid budget device this time around. The Moto G Power, which aside from its name not meaning much, actually has decent specs if you just want a simple, solid, sub $300 smartphone. And the Moto G Stylus, which is far and away Motorola's best G device they've ever released. Such a great phone with all the right specs and features, literally the best option for most people. And then there's this, the fourth Moto G for this year, which is just called the Moto G or Moto G 5G. It's not really good at anything. There's no unique standout feature, it doesn't have very good specs, it's not the cheapest, but it isn't that much more than the G Play. Even the 5G distinction doesn't really mean anything because the G Power is a 5G phone, even if it's not in the name, so is the G Stylus. The G Play isn't, which is odd for a phone in 2024, but considering how bad America's 5G networks still are, I can't imagine anyone opting for the Moto G 5G over the Play just because it has 5G capabilities. Originally, that's sort of what the Moto G 5G was all about. The first iteration of the Moto G 5G from 2020 was a sort of special 5G branded phone when 5G wasn't so widespread, but it also had a solid Snapdragon 750 processor powering it. You could get it with 6 gigabytes of RAM, a 1080 resolution display, a triple camera setup with an ultra-wide lens, and faster 20-watt charging speeds. All of those things are not on this 2024 Moto G 5G, if you can believe that. With each iteration of the Moto G since 2020, the phone has actually gotten worse in some spec or characteristic. And now what we're left with is this odd sort of budget 5G phone that's not all that great and a pretty confusing device if you're trying to keep track of Motorola's smartphone lineup. Now, in all honesty, the 2024 Moto G 5G isn't a bad phone. I'm certainly not going to call it the worst phone of the year, don't worry. If you need a budget 5G Android device and you can snag this one from your carrier at a discount, you'll get a decent enough smartphone that'll get you through the day reliably. It's just truly the last choice in Motorola's 4-phone G lineup this year. And other than from a point of absolute necessity, I'm not sure there's any real reason to choose it. Though I suppose if you were to get this phone for free, maybe it's worth it. This is one of those smartphones that every carrier is offering for some sort of a deal. On T-Mobile, it is literally free with a 2-year contract. As a prepaid phone from Verizon, it's $99, which is a heck of a lot cheaper than buying directly from Motorola. Its full retail price unlocked is technically $200 basically, but these phones are always on sale, even from Motorola themselves, like right now. But again, there's so many other carrier and prepaid options out there for this phone. I don't think anyone is ever going to pay more than like $100 for it. Of course, since this is basically a budget device, it's going to look and feel like one too, but Motorola brought some of the more premium elements to this phone versus the cheaper Moto G Play that at least make it feel modern and consistent with the higher priced Gs. At 6.6 inches, it's actually technically a 1/10 of an inch bigger screen size corner to corner from last year, and I know it doesn't look like it, but the bezels, those black borders that frame the screen, are smaller, kind of. So you get a better screen to body ratio, kind of. But the phone feels bigger than it really is with that extra bulk all around. And I know the bezels are like a 50-50 thing. 50% of people can't stand a budget phone that looks like this with the screen borders, and the other 50% don't even know what a bezel is. Around back, this is the main difference from the G Play. This phone has that faux eco leather covering the back. I don't really like the grayish, greenish, bluish color. It's just so bland and doesn't really match anything. A dark blue Motorola color would have been nice, but the fit and finish are definitely higher tier than its price tag suggests. Just know that the frame of this phone is very obviously plastic, even if it's trying to pretend to be metal or aluminum. So a couple other quick things to note. Headphone jack at the bottom, check. Dual speakers for a good out loud listening experience, check and check. Micro SD card, check. The phone is spec'd with 128 gigabytes of storage. It's your only option, which shockingly is twice as much as the 2023 Moto G. But the most important thing is you can pop in an SD card, move over some files and photos if you want to keep the phone free for other important things. like all the pre-installed Motorola apps. Just kidding about that, of course. You can and should uninstall as many of those as you can, along with all those fake scammy Moto folders that I talked about in my previous Motorola videos. I won't harp on that again, but Motorola has quickly developed a bloatware sickness that I hope they cure. Also, this phone has a physical fingerprint sensor, that power button combo, which is perfectly fine, not unexpected on a phone like this, and arguably probably better and more consistent and faster than a cheap in-display sensor. And there's Face Unlock too, which is even faster. Now, the biggest bummer in opting for the Moto G is the display. And not just because of its thick bezels that I talked about earlier, but because the screen itself is dim and low resolution. I mentioned this at the start, but this phone doesn't even have a 1080p display. It's 1612 by 720 resolution. And at 6.6 inches, that means you can absolutely pick out the pixels from even a normal viewing distance. The bigger the screen and the lower the resolution, the bigger the pixels need to be. And this is a phone that has a measly 267 pixels per inch. Most other phones are well over 300 pixels per inch or more. It just doesn't look sharp, especially when viewing text. And beyond that, it's an LCD display, so it's super dim and prone to glare. The LCD panel alone isn't the only thing that contributes to the glare, of course. The cheap no-name glass covering the front of the phone doesn't help either, and even at maximum brightness, you will literally be staring at your own reflection if anything dark comes across the screen. Keep in mind too, the 2020 Moto G 5G had a 1080 resolution 6.7-inch screen with HDR10 content support, and that was 4 years ago now. So really a downgrade from way back then, and not something Motorola changed or upgraded from last year's Moto G. On the bright side, this phone offers a 120Hz refresh rate, which you can enable in settings, which at least makes the phone visually look smoother and the phone feel a little faster, but I think I'd rather have a higher resolution OLED screen at 90Hz, or heck, even 60Hz if the content looks good. I feel like considering the price point and the intended customer, Motorola is probably focusing on the wrong thing here. Like, the average person is definitely going to tell if a screen looks too dim or too dull. They'll have a hard time seeing it and using it day in and day out, but they won't notice a 120Hz refresh rate versus a 90Hz refresh rate. And iPhones had 60Hz refresh rates for like ever, and we know people didn't care about that. So yeah, the screen specs kind of irk me a little bit, but I've been complaining about this for years on Motorola devices, and it wasn't even until this year's Moto G stylus that Motorola finally put a good display on a G series phone. Fortunately, even if you can't see the content you're watching all that well, you can hear it. The dual speaker setup on this phone is great, and here's a sound sample so you can hear it for yourself.
Love it when she smiling. White teeth with a heart of gold, and I'ma put a diamond in it. Ring, 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 ring. I'm calling. Ring like the camera is free. She calling. Ring, 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 ring. I'm calling. Ain't no bad man to pick you up. Stay calling.
So usually, year over year, smartphones and other tech things tend to get better, faster, more powerful, more capable, but Motorola has never really been one to adhere to that trend. Powering the 2024 Moto G is the Qualcomm Snapdragon 4 Gen 1 chip, which is arguably better than last year's phone, which had the Snapdragon 480, but just barely better. The 2022 Moto G had a Dimensity 700, which was better, even though it was older, and the 2020 Moto G 5G had the Snapdragon 750, which for a processor from 2020, it isn't that much worse than what's in this phone today. This phone also has only 4 GB of RAM, which isn't really a whole lot. I mean, it's not detrimental to performance necessarily, but come on, an extra 2 gigs of RAM couldn't possibly have put this phone over Motorola's budget. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this phone is far from bad. It doesn't perform nearly as poorly as last year's G Play did. And for most people, I actually think it's a perfectly fine device. In fact, you can game on this phone without much issue. I think most people expect any Snapdragon processor to perform well, and the 4 Gen 1 is a solid SoC that can handle plenty, even if you do like to push your phone a bit. It's just one of those things where jumping to the Moto G Power, for example, yields you so much more spec-wise, a way better processor and more RAM, that if performance is your thing, that phone is worth the extra bucks. And on the opposite end, the The G Play is perfectly fine this year, so if you want a cheap phone, you don't have to sacrifice much more in opting for that one instead. I would call this phone a sidestep more than anything else from last year to this year and compared to this year's G Play. And like I also already explained, I guess if you need the 5G or you're in an area where your specific carrier has great coverage, maybe if you're out and about, it's worth it, but that's such a small subset of people, I can't imagine it would be a deciding factor. The other thing to consider is that while no Moto G device is necessarily first in line for software updates, this phone is far down the list. This phone will probably get Android 15 in like a year, but beyond that, who knows? And Motorola isn't doing much with their Android experience, like Samsung and Google with their Pixel devices and all that AI stuff. Like, I guess if you aren't interested in that at all, this relatively simple Android setup will be right up your alley, but I suspect some folks might start to feel a little behind the times if this is the software setup you have a year or two from now. This phone very much falls under the threshold of buy a new one every year, or at least every 2 years, and I can't recommend it beyond that, and I certainly wouldn't buy it if you're watching this video in 2025 or later. Hello, future people. One nice thing about, well, all of Motorola's phones this year is that they all have the same sized 5,000 milliamp batteries, including this one. And I suspect most people will pull a full day of use from this without much issue. My biggest recommendation is just get a better charging brick and cable to pair with it. I say this in like every Motorola video. Motorola has done this weird thing where they changed the wired charging speeds like every year. It used to be 20 watt, then it was 15 watt, now it's 18 watt. That's not a huge deal, but the bigger issue is them tossing in a USB-A cable and no charging brick. So go out and get a couple USB-C cables and a couple 18 watt bricks, and you'll be able to juice this phone up in like an hour or less if you ever need to charge it anyway. Finally, if you want to take pictures and videos with this phone, you can, but this is the sort of camera setup that is very much budget, and it's probably what's furthest away from any modern smartphone with a price tag above like $300. The dual lens setup around back is hardly a dual lens setup. There's a 50 megapixel main lens, and then a 2 megapixel macro used for super close-up pictures, which, okay, the few times you take a picture of a bug on the ground or a single word in a textbook, I guess you'll be happy to have it. But a wide-angle lens, for example, would just be so much more useful day in and day out. The selfie camera is also just an 8 megapixel lens, which is the same as last year. And Motorola gives you their standard issue shooting options that are enough to not feel like you have a subpar camera setup, but with the actual pictures and videos you capture, the secret is out. It's not really the best result. Like, are these the worst pictures in the world? No, of course not. But when modern smartphones are fighting to replace cinema cameras and four-figure DSLRs, this phone is giving you just enough to capture a special moment in good lighting and not much more than that. It's really odd to me how wide the gap is between the camera specs on this phone and like any other $300 plus Android device now, and especially the flagships, obviously. And Motorola has done little the last few years to play catch up, but maybe they're waiting for both the hardware to get super cheap and their software, if they ever update it, to finally be ready. And then they'll end up making huge leaps in the next year or two with the camera setups, which will finally round out a phone like this to be a solid budget device. So I think if you're a fan of Motorola and are looking for a new device this year, or just want a cheap, affordable Android, the G Play is your cheap option. The G Power is your value option with plenty of good specs, and the G Stylus is your all-in, top-spec, most upgraded option. This regular Moto G 5G is just sort of a 5G phone that doesn't really offer anything else specific. And I suppose if you got it for free, it's perfectly fine. You're not going to hate it. You're not going to hate Motorola. You're not going to hate yourself, but it just isn't the best option. It's not even the second or third best option. Heck, there's a bunch of other Android phones that might make more sense than this too. I don't really know what Motorola is supposed to do with their Moto G 5G now. I argued in my Moto G Power review that phone should just be the Moto G, since the power classification doesn't refer to anything specific anymore, but it'll be interesting to see in the next year or two how Motorola upgrades, streamlines, or maybe does nothing at all with their very odd Moto G device. But what do you guys think? Is there any real reason to get this phone, even if it were free? Do you have one yourself? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys later.